Okay, good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending what is our 17th annual Convergence Summit. Unusual event this year. It's a fully virtual event that we're running over 3 days. So who would have thought we'd be in this position this time last year? But great to have been able to put on hopefully what's a very interesting event over the next 3 days. Lots of great presentations, lots of content and exhibition stands. So please do make the most of the event. If you've got questions, please type them in the chat, and we'll go through it at the end of each presentation. And if there's other things you want to know that maybe aren't covered, stick it in the chat, and we'll come back to you and make sure that you're getting the most out of the event. So what I'd like to do is introduce our first keynote for the event, which is Carl Francis from Podium Systems. So Carl is going to talk through time to rethink leadership for a distributed workforce. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Carl. Okay, away we go.
Okay, so they were just doing the screen sharing thing. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can see my screen and me okay. I'll introduce myself. My name is Carl Francis. I am a chartered psychologist and associate fellow of the British Psychological Society and a registered occupational psychologist with a practicing certificate from the Health and Care Professions Council, HCPC. My email signature tells me that I am the European Operations Director from an organisation called Podium. Podium is an international industrial occupational psychology consultancy. We are assessment specialists who develop our own psychometric tests, as well as the IT platforms with which to deliver them. And we also offer organizational consultancy services, including in the area of leadership, for example. And of course, that's going to be pretty much the theme of today's discussion. So the context for today's discussion, very much in line with the theme of the conference, is about how to thrive within the new normal. Is based around this idea that our traditional structures and work patterns may have been disrupted through current circumstances. And we want to consider whether our traditional and conventional leadership practices remain appropriate and relevant as we move into this much discussed new normal. Of course, conventional leadership might be seen as having that single line of vertical authority. And that leader therefore exercises all of the roles and responsibilities we expect of a leadership position. But we want to ask whether that will remain relevant as things are changing in ways that we will define. So we want to have a look at whether there is anything we can learn from the world of work psychology and research in this area that might help us to understand how leadership can remain or perhaps increase effectiveness if we're now working in different work structures and work patterns than before, particularly if we are now required to work in virtual or distributed rather than conventional workplace co-located teams. So to help us structure this discussion, I want to tell you a little bit about work psychology. If you've not engaged much with psychology or psychologists, I want to be clear about what it is that we hope to offer. And we'll focus on a couple of important constructs from within psychological research, particularly around areas of personality and how they might inform leadership processes. We'll have a look at some important variables for the effectiveness of virtual teams. We'll talk about team virtuality and some specific leadership processes. Although all of that theory and research will only ever be beneficial if we can find meaningful practical applications for that theory. And we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of this session. So to begin with, I'd like just to do a little bit to help us understand work psychology. And I introduced myself in the way that I did for a reason, because in reality, I really don't like to introduce myself in that way if I can possibly avoid it, simply because my experience is if I ever say, good morning, my name's Carl and I'm a psychologist, my experience is perhaps some rather unusual reactions. The most common of which is something along the lines of, oh gosh, you're a psychologist, isn't that interesting? I bet you're analysing me now, isn't it? Perhaps because people have not got experience or understanding of what a psychologist really is or really does. The truth is, despite any other rumours, a psychologist is quite simply a scientist. And like all scientists, what we do is to try to develop theories and models to help us understand and explain the observable phenomena in the world around us. You'll be familiar with this idea, I'm sure, from your own experience within science, perhaps your school science lessons, from which you'll remember the story, for example, of Isaac Newton, who on one particular occasion was sat in his garden in Lincolnshire, not too far from where I'm sat today, when he observed an apple falling from his tree. Now, being a scientist, rather than just looking up from his book and saying, oh gosh, an apple just fell from my tree, he asked, why? When the apple parted company from the tree, did it head in a straight line accelerating towards the surface of the earth? What caused that? What made that happen? And from that simple observation, he developed his theory of gravity, the idea of two objects of relative mass will experience an attractive force between them, and that was what led to his observation. From that theory, he developed some models that predicts what should happen in the world around us. And of course, we still use those models, Newton's laws of motion, in physics and science today. As psychologists, however, rather than being interested in the inanimate world of objects like apples and rocks, we're much more interested in the phenomena that can be observed in the world of people. And I'm sure that you too will have observed many of these phenomena. You're likely to know some people who are outgoing, warm, friendly, enthusiastic, energetic, optimistic. Perhaps you'll know other people who are rather more quiet, reserved, shy, retiring, preferring to avoid the spotlight than being the center of attention. You may well also know some people who seem to be able to understand new, complex, sophisticated, difficult concepts with apparent ease, whereas others of us take rather longer to understand the same level of sophistication and complexity. Now, if you've observed those things in people, you might have been curious as to what explains those things, what causes them. And if you've asked yourself those questions and made those observations, you are interested in a core topic that cuts across much of psychology. And it's the idea of developing theories and models that can help explain and understand those observable individual differences. And if you study individual differences, you will very quickly find that they break down into two major domains of interest and analysis. Psychologists refer to these as the first domain being perhaps the domain of maximum performance, what we are able to do related to our abilities. Once upon a time, psychologists might have talked about concepts like intelligence, although we operationalize that in a more concrete way in modern psychology. The other area of individual differences of interest, and the one that perhaps we'll draw on most widely today, is the area of typical performance. Psychological theory has it that our personality is what sits behind our preferences, for characteristic behavior. So our typical performance, characteristic behavior, preferences for style regardless of the situation. Now, if we have a look at the story of personality, and I want to give you a brief insight into that to give us a vocabulary to discuss personality as a function of leadership. If we look at the story of personality, going back about 100 years, psychologists started to systematically research what might cause our personality to be what it is. And to cut a much longer story short, over time, it emerged that whenever you study personality, and different studies in different times and different places, independently of each other, started to reveal a common picture. And that common picture eventually led to the definition of what was known as a 5-factor model of personality, often referred to as the Big Five. It is perhaps the most widely studied, validated, and accepted model of personality, particularly as it is applied to the workplace. It is quite prevalent. You'll see it in lots of places. I don't know whether you saw a story just last week in the news media about how our personality might influence the music we prefer to listen to. And if you listened to people discussing that research, it became apparent that it was the Big Five model that they were associating with musical choice. Now, we can use various acronyms to help us remember the Big Five. OCEAN is one of them. More commonly, the NEO-AC acronym is used, and N is for neuroticism. So again, I want to describe the Big Five so that we can use those in our discussion around leadership. N is for neuroticism. Unfortunately, it is a term that's perhaps become misunderstood in popular use. And if you were to describe somebody as neurotic, they might take that as a form of insult, where technically, very correctly, neuroticism simply refers to a degree of emotional reactivity. So a neurotic person is emotionally reactive. They will perhaps respond to emotional situations in terms and with their own emotions. The E of neo is extroversion. I'm sure we've all got our own stereotypical idea of what an extrovert looks like, but it does go rather beyond the person who likes to dance on the tables at parties. It is true that extroverts can be spontaneous, bold, fun-loving, outgoing, but they are also often energized by an opportunity to come to the fore, be in the spotlight, and even influence, control, and authority over others. The O in neo is for openness, and people who are high in openness are open to new experiences. They like to go, both literally and metaphorically, to new places, try new things, experience different aspects of the world. They perhaps live their life with their foot metaphorically hard on the accelerator, keen to move on to the next thing, discover what's around the next corner. So intellectually curious and adventurous, open to new experiences. The A of the NEO-AC part of this acronym is agreeableness. And the agreeable person likes to be liked. They work hard to get along. So they're very cooperative. They'll often put the needs of others before their own needs. And above all else, highly agreeable people will work very hard to avoid conflict. And the C is for conscientiousness. Conscientious people are dutiful, meticulous. They are intolerant of chaos. They like to plan, follow procedures, and therefore dutiful, meticulous, conscientious. Now, we'll use those concepts of personality as we go forward to discuss the context and challenge that we have defined. So we've talked about the fact that our traditional leadership structures and our traditional organizational structures and work patterns may have been disrupted by our current challenges. So we have to ask whether our conventional models of leadership remain relevant as we move towards this new normal. We might have described our conventional models of leadership as that single line of vertical authority, and those leadership processes that we indicated earlier would have been exercised across that span of control through that single line of vertical authority. But as I'm sure many of us are very aware, those traditional patterns of work and traditional structures may now well have been disrupted or disturbed. And we have started, for many of us, to work in new ways and in new patterns, perhaps as a dispersed or distributed team, more in the virtual space. So we are observing a continued need for non-traditional working patterns, non-traditional team structures, and work locations. What's really interesting to observe is the emerging evidence of the likely permanence of that change. We are already talking to quite large numbers of client organizations who are talking about disposing of their real estate, adopting these virtual and dispersed structures as a way of permanent working going forward. So our previously co-located teams are perhaps now becoming dispersed or virtual teams that do what they did in co-located locations in the virtual or digital space. Now, of course, there will be many consequences to those changes, and much to discuss over time. But we know that there is a relationship between leadership and team effectiveness. So as we are moving from our traditional work structures to virtual teams, what's going to happen to leadership and leadership effectiveness in this new normal? And we'll have to ask whether our traditional concepts of leadership and vertical, single lines of vertical authority will remain effective for those virtual or dispersed teams. So we're going to look towards the psychological research and research evidence that might tell us about leadership and what might be effective for leadership and team effectiveness for virtual or dispersed teams. Now, to help us discuss this and understand what might be important, I'm going to offer you this model. And as you can see, we've attributed this model to a paper published in 2017 in the Human Resource Management Review. And it begins by identifying a traditional linear process that might influence team performance. It's always been understood that the personality or the personality composition of a team will have an influence over the leadership style and leadership processes that have emerged. And we know that leadership has an influence over team performance. But we can now add an intervening variable into that linear process, a variable in terms of team virtuality. And we're going to discuss all of these concepts in a little bit more detail. So let me define and describe, first of all, a little bit more about what is meant by team personality composition. Now, of course, a team is made up of a number of individuals, and those individuals obviously work together to form a team. A team is defined as a bunch of individuals who work towards a common goal or a common purpose. But when you put all of those individuals together and each of those individual personalities together, you can combine them to define what is known as this TPC or team personality composition. And that personality composition can be described, defined, or calculated in various ways. One of the most common, sometimes referred to as the elevation dimension, is effectively like the average team personality. So, for example, you could measure the level of extroversion of every team member, add up all of those extroversion scores, divide by the number in the team to come up with some average level of extroversion within the team. There are other ways of defining and describing that personality composition, having a look at the variability of traits that exist within the team, the range of traits, the proportion of team members, or quite simply the range that exists within a particular team. So quite simply, the idea is that you can characterize a team in some way in terms of the composition, the totality of personality that exists from individual team members. Of course, individual personality traits will lead to individual behaviors that affect team processes. And of course, the team process that we want to focus on mostly today is that process of leadership, or processes that sit behind leadership, which we know has a relationship to effectiveness. So questions that might arise from understanding team personality composition are around how team personality composition affects the leadership processes that might be observed within a team, and questions whether team personality composition can have an effect on overall team performance. So, for example, do teams of like personalities, homogeneous team personality compositions, perform better than teams of diverse personalities? We'll explore those questions as we go forward. To define that variable of team virtuality, it is possible to objectively describe the extent to which a team is a virtual team. So a virtual team, according to our definition of teamwork given earlier, is a team that works together across distance to achieve some common goal. And we can objectively discuss the degree of virtuality in terms of, for example, how much opportunity do team members have to have personal or face-to-face contact? Do they have any or none at all? The geographical distance between team members can be important. Do team members work in the same time zones? I've actually worked for many years in a virtual team that spans both hemispheres, from New Zealand right through to Europe. And the perceived isolation of team members is important. A concept that's important here of a virtual team, or for a virtual team, is the opportunity that team members have for spontaneous contact and conversation. If you work in a co-located team and you want to discuss something, it might be easy to get up, walk across the office, walk down the corridor and talk to a fellow team member face-to-face spontaneously. Are there opportunities for that spontaneous contact, or in the virtual team, is contact only formal and formalized? So the Monday morning Zoom meeting, for example. So to what degree do team members feel isolated, and what degree of opportunity exists for spontaneous contact and conversation? The idea, as presented in our model, is that virtuality will have an intervening effect between the personality composition of the team and some of the team processes. And of course, as we said, the key process we want to focus on here is leadership. So if we begin to discuss leadership in virtual teams, of course, a virtual team will still have that traditional vertical leader that has perhaps that positional, formal responsibility and authority. But we can observe that there are additional processes that can augment leadership and therefore team effectiveness. So we'll discuss the concept of emergent leadership and shared leadership. So to define emergent leadership, very simply, this is the observation that some individuals will exert significant influence over other team members, even without being assigned any formal level of positional power or authority. They simply step up, they take the lead, they recognize the need and accept a challenge. We'll have a look at what might sit behind emergent leadership. To define shared leadership, this is a collective process. And again, rather than having a formal positional authority, a number of people might get together in this collective individual process to work together to participate and take shared collective leadership within a particular task or challenge. Now, I do want to make it clear that these two supplementary processes are not about displacing or supplanting, undermining or usurping the lead from the traditional leader. That leadership position still remains in place with equal importance, but these are supplementary processes that can enhance team performance. And if they will enhance team performance, perhaps it's important to understand them, to understand what might lead to, support and foster these leadership processes for best effect and greatest organizational benefit. So what do we know about leadership, emergent leadership? What's the evidence for emergent leadership? So just to present a few examples from many available here, this 2003 study showed that high-performing teams had strong emergent leadership evident, whereas low-performing teams demonstrated no degree of emergent leadership. This 2006 study had a look at how emergent leadership impacted team performance, and all high-performing teams in that study exhibited these processes of emergent leadership. And a 2011 study, which looked specifically at virtual teams and virtual team performance, demonstrated that emergent leadership had a positive relationship to team performance. So to summarize those examples, emergent leadership is positively related to team performance. So we might ask ourselves then, well, okay, what leads to emergent leadership? In what circumstances is emergent leadership likely to happen? Well, in terms of individual personality constructs, individuals high on extroversion are much more likely to emerge as leaders. I said earlier that one of the attributes of extroversion, as well as being outgoing, sociable, energetic, and fun-loving, is that extroverts are energized by the opportunity to exert perhaps influence and power over others. So extroverts tend to step up and emerge as leaders. You tend to find that people who are higher in openness also tend to step forward as emergent leaders. If we look at team personality composition, however, so that aggregated personality of all team members as a whole, you tend to find that higher or lower levels of openness are less beneficial to team performance, and moderate levels of openness as a team personality composite is seen as much more effective. We'll perhaps touch on that again a little bit later on. In terms of shared leadership, again, what's the evidence for that? Well, shared leadership has been seen to be linked to collaborative decision making. Perhaps almost by definition, shared leadership is that collaborative process. But it's that collaboration that has been seen to lead to increases in trust and knowledge sharing. And in turn, trust and knowledge sharing has been seen to link to higher team performance, particularly in virtual teams. So in a couple of studies cited here, one that looked at 96 virtual teams and another looked at 101 virtual teams, on both of those very large scale studies, we see shared leadership resulting in either higher performance or being a more stable predictor of team performance than simple vertical or hierarchical leadership. So what kind of conditions support the emergence of shared leadership within teams? Well, in terms of individual personality traits, highly agreeable individuals are much more likely to engage in shared leadership. Again, we saw that those agreeable people, they like to get along, they like to avoid conflict, they are much more likely to be collaborative. In terms of team personality composition, again, that aggregated team personality construct, you find that team personalities that are high in conscientiousness and emotional stability tend to relate to higher levels of both shared leadership and therefore team performance. You do tend to find that if your team personality composition is very high in extroversion, so your team is made up of lots of high-scoring extroverts, that does reduce the shared leadership and team performance. Perhaps that's not surprising, having just seen that extroverts like to emerge as individual leaders. And if we have lots of extroverts all vying to take charge, then that could explain that reduced team effectiveness. And again, this moderate levels of openness rather than very high or low levels of openness relate to shared leadership and performance. The explanation is thought to be something along the lines that if people, for example, are very high in openness, they might actually tend to get sidetracked with philosophical discussions and wild flights of fancy. Just to discuss this idea of team personality composition and team performance, it's perhaps sometimes been the received wisdom that suggests that diversity is much more likely to lead to higher levels of team performance. Those of you who are familiar with the ideas of Meredith Belbin, for example, might have been familiar with the idea that only teams that fulfill all of the team role requirements and each require different personalities perhaps are likely to have fewer role gaps. But actually the evidence is that higher levels of cohesion, actually more homogeneous team personalities tend to be more effective than heterogeneous team personalities. And in the study cited here from 2018, it was found that those homogeneous teams had higher team cohesion, both in the social dimension, they identified with the team, they related better socially, as well as being much more task focused and much more team cohesion around tasks, leading to higher levels of team performance. So team learning and team performance was much higher for homogeneous teams in those studies, and actually performance increased over time for homogeneous teams. So very quickly, as I know time is pressing on, to try and summarize and apply some practical lessons to take us forward to thrive and rebuild in the new normal. Currently, virtual teams might have been forced upon us, and we might have had to adopt virtual teams in perhaps an unplanned way. But it is possible that in future they could be more carefully designed. And as we do that, we'll need to understand the personality of the individuals and the team personality composition. And perhaps we can cluster individuals into more homogeneous groups, because that's been shown perhaps to lead to higher levels of trust and effectiveness. Greater learning and team effectiveness is maximized when conflicts are minimized through having homogeneous approaches rather than heterogeneous approaches. We have seen that both emergent leadership and shared leadership are beneficial for team performance. So understanding the personality constructs that support those things must be important to us. Shared leadership also emerges from social relationships and from socially related processes and information exchange. As we said earlier, individuals in virtual teams can feel more isolated and can't benefit from the same social processes. So maybe we need to think about whether we can facilitate the opportunities for that shared leadership to emerge, to make sure that even in a virtual and digital space, there are opportunities for those water cooler conversations that are much more possible in co-located environments. We perhaps also need to train team members and train existing leaders to spot, understand and foster both these shared and emergent leadership behaviors, not as a threat to our traditional vertical leadership, but as supplementary processes that can be beneficial to all. Perhaps then we can select team members in future to plan our teams. We can select people with profiles that support emergent and shared leadership to ensure that our team personality composition is likely to lead to greatest organizational effectiveness. So personality can be used to plan and manage leadership effectiveness if we are able to objectively describe and understand the personalities of the individuals in our teams. That's the end.